Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at different approaches to the book of Revelation in our continuing study of end times prophecy. There are four basic approaches, and these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. I don't want to pretend that they are. I think there might be some overlap between them, and even a good looking at this book. First is what we could call the idealistic approach that just sees the idea of Jesus fighting the forces of darkness and Jesus wins. And I think that's there. I just don't know that that's the only aspect that we should see in the book of Revelation. Secondly, the preterist approach, and the word preterist, we've already discussed preterism before, has the idea it's already been fulfilled. I do think there are some things in the book of Revelation that have already been fulfilled. In fact, I think most people would agree that at least there are things in the first couple of chapters that have seen at least some measure of fulfillment. Now, full preterism says that Jesus came back and there's no future second coming. I don't hold to that at all. The partial preterism says that he came back in AD 70, but there's still a future coming of Jesus. I don't really see myself as a partial preterist either. I have my issues with both of those approaches. But I do see the book of Revelation as having some application to people living in the first century, and we'll look at that. Thirdly, the historical approach sees the book of Revelation as having fulfillment all throughout church history. And again, I think there are applications all throughout church history. Um, and then culminating when, in other words, we're not finished yet. The story's not done yet. And the historical approach says, yes, it's been being fulfilled all throughout church history. And then at the end, Jesus comes, and that's the end. So there are applications that I think are good in that. But I'm not sure that I would see myself as a historicist in that sense. And then finally, the futurist approach says that except for the first two or three chapters, everything is yet to be fulfilled. So it really doesn't have any relevance for us for today, except that we're looking for the second coming. So it's entirely in the future. Now, let's look at the structure of the book. And I'm not trying to pick sides, but just what's in the book itself. I've divided it here, and I think this is appropriate, into seven groups. We're going to see a lot of sevens in the book of Revelation. You begin chapters 1 through 3. John is on the island of Patmos, and he has a vision of Jesus. And Jesus speaks to him about writing 7 letters to 7 churches that are in what we call modern day Turkey. They're in ancient, I guess you could call it either Asia, or the Greeks called it Anatolia. I usually use that term. Modern day Turkey. And there were 7 churches there. And then we get to chapter 4, and suddenly there's a door open in heaven, and John, at least in the spirit, in this vision, is brought up to the presence of God, the throne of God, and the one sitting on the throne, that's God, is holding a scroll that is sealed with 7 seals. And there's a big question: can it be opened or not? And nobody is worthy. But then the announcement comes: no, there is one who's worthy, and of course it's Jesus. And he begins to open that scroll. Breaking to open it, you have to break each of the seals, and they're each broken one at a time. And things happen all throughout chapter 6, and they are judgments, and they are bad things, and there's wars, and there's death, and then you finally come to the 6th seal, and the kings of the earth are saying, no, please, no, the wrath of the Lamb is against us. And the 7th seal, as that is broken in chapter 7, that gives rise to another set of 7 trumpets. So you go 1 through 6, and then the 7th introduces the next set of 7, and you have 7 trumpets, and they are blown. And again, you have judgments with each one of those all throughout chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11. You get to the last one, and after that's blown, you're eventually going to have 7 vials, 7 bowls of wrath. But first, there's you could call it an intermission, where the scene changes, and you see the scene in heaven with a woman who's giving birth to a child, and there's the dragon there, and there's this heavenly war being described, and a beast that comes out in chapter 13. But then you have those 7 bowls of judgment. So notice we had 7 seals, and the seventh one introduced the seventh trumpet, or 7 trumpets. And then the seventh trumpet introduces this next section, which leads to 7 bowls. And then you finish the bowls. And in chapter 17, you have a new vision, a harlot, a prostitute, and she is sitting on trying to take a ride on a dragon. And there's 7 hills there, and you get to chapter 19, and she is judged, and now the bride comes, and you see a picture, a very obvious picture, I think, of Jesus on a white horse, and he's coming for his bride. And chapter 20, you have where the king he reigns, and so you've got his reign. There's a reference to for 1,000 years, and then chapter 21 and 22, you have a new heavens and a new earth. So that's the movement of the entire book. Now the question is, what on earth do we do with all those? How do we organize that? How do we understand it? The idealist sees this as 7 pictures of Christ and his people, and they overcome and he overcomes. And I think that there is that. The question is it just that, or is it just 7 unrelated pictures? How do we make sense of this? Is this just about the past? Is it just about the future? Is it both? Is it neither? What do we do with it? So the idealist sees these as 7 pictures, and I'm going to use the same terminology, although I don't necessarily see myself as just an idealist. I think there's more to the picture than that. But I do think there are 7 pictures of Jesus, and he wins, and his people win, all throughout there. Next, the preterist, and remember I said that I'm not a preterist. The view here sees John, his vision is symbolic visions of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, in the year 70. Um, and one of the big issues, the most obvious thing, is that this isn't written to the people in Jerusalem. This isn't written to Jewish people. This is written to 7 churches that aren't primarily Jewish, they're primarily Gentile, and they're not anywhere near Israel. They're over in Anatolia, in what we call Western Turkey today. And of course, the other question is the book written before the fall of Jerusalem or after the fall of Jerusalem? Now, I think it might have been written before the fall of Jerusalem, but it doesn't specifically say. So I don't want to be dogmatic there, I'm not sure that it. I think it matters a little bit. I don't think it hinges our interpretation either way. I would be willing to say, though, that these visions are against the backdrop, whether it had already taken place or whether it was about to. It's against the backdrop of the fall of Jerusalem, so that provides some of the imagery. And yes, that was a big deal, but it wasn't quite such a big deal to the people that weren't Jewish and living anywhere close to them. So yes, I see some of the observations that my preterist friend might point out, but I am decidedly, um, I'm going to say this sort of strong. I'm decidedly anti-preterist in that, and excuse me for saying it that way, but I really am. Now, we have historical approaches to the book of Revelation, and in this view, in chapters 1 through 3, each church is seen as picturing an era of the church. So, the letter to the church at Ephesus, that's the church, like in the first couple of hundred years, and then you move through, and they actually assign a different era of church history. And by the way, one of the things I teach is church history. So I'm somewhat familiar with the church history, and I'm also somewhat familiar how it doesn't fit nice and cleanly. So you have noted chapters 1 through 3, each church pictures an era of the church, and then all of the seals and the trumpets and the bowls are symbols of God's works and the issues and the tribulations and the problems throughout the history of the church. And you sort of segment them into, okay, this is the early church history, and then this is the church after Constantine, and then this is the church of the monasteries, and this is the church of the Reformation. And this view was first proposed, the first time I came across it was seeing it in the 1700s. And what happens is they keep changing as church history goes on, each group has seen their era as the church, the final church of Laodicea. Remember, that's the backslidden church, the church that's lukewarm. And each era for the last couple of 300 or 400 years have been seeing their era. Okay, we're as bad as it's going to be. Jesus is going to come back anytime now. Um, and I suspect if this view is still around 100 years from now, that they will still be saying, "Yep, we finally entered the church of the Laodicean age. We thought it was bad before. Now it's really bad." Uh, I don't know that for sure. But and then notice at the end, the entire narrative comes to a conclusion where Jesus comes back and establishes a kingdom and new heavens and new earth, and you go on for eternity. So that's the historical approach to the book of Revelation. The futurist approach, and I'm painting with a broad brush, so there may be futurists that don't paint it exactly this way, but generally they would look at chapters 1 through 3 as what was taking place in the past and also in the day in which the book of Revelation was written. And then as John is sort of taken in the spirit to heaven in chapter at the beginning of chapter 4, they see that's everything that's going to take place not just in John's future, but in our future as well. So that it views all of the events, generally speaking, from chapter 4 to chapter 18 as taking place in a future time of great tribulation. So none of that applies for today. I mean, if Jesus comes back today, it could begin to apply, but that's really all set for the future. And then at the end of chapter 19, Jesus comes back, and he is, and depending on if you're premillennial or historical premillennial, remember there's different views there. I'm not going to get into those right now. But the King reigns in chapter 20, and you have a new heavens and new earth, and that's the end. That's the end of the story. So most of it, notice the central part of the book from chapter 4 all the way to chapter 19 take place in this future period of tribulation. Now, finally, and this is going to maybe look a little bit like, the what we described as the idealistic view, but I don't think it is. That sees seven portraits of Jesus, but at the end of each one of these, notice you have chapters 1 through 3, and you have these seven letters to seven churches, and at the end of each letter, there's a promise of Jesus coming back. So, and because the whole book of Revelation is promises, um, I'm going to say, now it's not saying he's coming back seven times. It's talking about his return, but it's seven promises about his return. And then chapter 4, we already talked about the throne of God and the scroll and the seven seals and the one who's worthy. Um, and you get to the end of that section, chapter 7, verse 17, where Christ wipes away every tear. That's another way of saying, I think, Jesus comes back. So it's a picture of what happens, and then Jesus returns. Now, notice you could say that happens in 7 years, or you could say that happens all throughout church history, but however, whatever prophetic view you take, and I'm not trying to say it only fits this view, only amillennial or premillennial or postmillennial or dispensational. But Jesus comes back and wipes away every tear. And then you get to chapters 8 through 11. That's the seven trumpets, and you get to chapter 11, and we read the words that Christ will reign forever and ever. Now that sounds like Jesus comes back. And it's not that he's coming back a third or a fourth time. These are all descriptions, how you have a picture of the bad things that take place, and then Jesus comes back. And chapter 12 through 16, actually chapter 12 begins with the birth of Jesus. So you can't say it's all in consecutive order because Jesus is born in chapter 12. Well, that's going back and looking at it again. I think each one is doing that. And you have this war in heaven and the dragon and the beast and the seven bowls. And you get to chapter 16, verse 17. As the nations fall, you hear the announcement, it is finished. It is done. Well, that sounds like Jesus came back. And then chapters 17 through 19, you have this picture of the harlot trying to go for a ride on the dragon, and he ends up gobbling her up, and it's messy and it's bad. And you get to chapter 19, and everybody agrees chapter 19, Jesus comes back. I don't think there's too many. I shouldn't say everybody. I'm sure there are those that disagree. But the rider on the white horse, and he comes, and he wins, and that's Jesus. And everybody agrees it's Jesus. And then in chapter 20, however you take that, whether premillennial or amillennial, but the king reigns, everybody agrees on that. And it ends with the judgment and the lake of fire, and those whose names are not written in the book of life, they are cast into the lake of fire. And notice Jesus did his judgment. Yeah, I'm not going to say necessarily came back, but it ends with judgment. And then chapters 21 and 22 is this vision of the new heavens and the new earth. And at the end, it ends by Jesus saying, I am coming quickly. In other words, Jesus comes back. So that you have 7 pictures of Jesus, at the end of which each one ends on the note where he comes and he judges and he reigns and he rules and he makes all things right. Now, finally, in closing, I'd like to look at one last way of looking at the book of Revelation. This is seeing Revelation as what's known as a chiasm, that is a sort of an inverted, parallel series of outlines. Notice we begin with 7 letters to 7 churches. That's chapters 1 through 3. Look down at the bottom, New Jerusalem, the bride of Christ. Now, 7 churches and the bride of Christ, I submit that they are just 2 ways of saying the same thing. That it's speaking to and of the church. But then notice you get chapters 4 and 5, that's where John has this vision before the throne of God. And chapters 19 and 20, you have Christ coming and ruling and reigning from a throne and a throne. Notice the 7 seals, there's judgments against the nations. Chapter 17 through 18, judgments against Babylon. So nations in Babylon, I'm not saying they're the same thing, but there's a picture of judgment in both cases. And then 144,000 are mentioned in chapter 7, leading to 7 trumpets. There are 144,000 mentioned again. I don't think it's a different group. I think it's the same group. We'll talk in a future class about who that is. And 7 bulls in chapters 14 through 16. There are 2 witnesses in chapter 11 and 2 beasts, and they're certainly not the same thing. But notice 2 and 2 in chapters 11 and again in chapter 13. And then the pivotal point in the middle, which we said already, that goes back to the birth of Jesus again, and where you have the woman who's giving birth and the male child and the dragon, and that's in chapter 12. So there is both there's both these series of sevens, but also nestled in there is this beautiful pattern that we see of it's almost, I don't want to say it's poetry, but almost it's structured in a very careful and thoughtful way. This isn't just a bunch of visions that are thrown together. No, there's a wonderful structure and pattern to this book, and we're going to begin looking at it back in chapter 1 next time.